Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with an insightful conversation today with three great minds on the state of political theology and American evangelicalism. Today, our conversation partners are our own Mark Levesque, editor of Providence himself, now teaching at a military associated school in Annapolis, Maryland. Daniel Strand, another Providence contributor, teaching at another military-related school in Alabama, which he's free to describe if he'd like to. And then finally, Jonathan Lehman with the Nine Marks organization here in the Washington, D.C. area, and himself the author of a very distinguished work on political theology. So I'm going to start with Jonathan in terms of where are we today in terms of the front of political theology for American evangelicals. The waters seem choppy and troubled, but what is your assessment, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, here we are a few weeks after the events of January 6th, and I think a lot of people are reeling from that and not trying to understand that. Christian nationalism has been a hot topic of late. I think a lot of us have been talking about that in some version or other for decades. Nonetheless, it's sort of on everybody's radar screen. I think if you look at events like that, or just the larger thing of the Trump era, or things like Black Lives Matters and how that's divided many Christians in certain respects, I think these are all more symptoms of what's going on in political theology generally. For me, the larger issues at play are questions of what is the place of liberalism? What is the relationship between sort of classical liberalism, whether again it's classical or even more contemporary Rawlsian forms, and Christianity? Once upon a time, these things were partners. And we're at a place now, however, where I think that question is up for grabs. So on the one hand, you have people like Patrick Deneen and others who are saying, hey, look, a lot of this stuff that you see going on right now, all of this is a consequence of the fact that liberalism has not failed, but succeeded, right? And he's not the only one saying that. I've said that in one form or others. Others have been saying that as well. Okay, so you have some people are kind of responding to the conversation that way. Then you have other people who are saying, no, we need to double down on some of these conversations about classical liberalism. I think David French would be one prominent example, but I have other friends who are saying, no, we just got to stick with that and providing kind of a neutral space where people can come and debate different worldviews. That's what we need to do. So that's the question. Is the relationship? I think that's the big question. Is the relationship between classical liberalism and Christianity, which in certain respects worked, one could argue, for the founders, still going to work today? Or do we have to move on to something different? Is there a way we can get the best of both? Stick with my Christian convictions and have certain elements of classical liberal institutions and so forth. And I've been talking long enough, but just, in a nutshell, I think a lot of the things that we're seeing ongoing right now, and then the disputes within Christianity among Christians, Black Lives Matter or not, reparations or not, that's one conversation. What's the place of Christian nationalism? Should pastors be endorsing political candidates or not? Right? What's the role of Christians in the Democrat Party or the Republican Party? All of these more surface level, urgent questions have underneath them these deeper issues that we're still working through.
Jonathan, in terms of American Christianity's seeming, at least parts of its rejection of liberalism, for Roman Catholicism, we have conservative friends who are going into integralism. It's not clear whether there's any equivalent intellectual response among evangelicals. I guess the activist response, the extreme activist response, would be the events of January 6th. But is there an intellectual equivalent to integralism among evangelicals?
Well, that's funny you should ask that. There is. I would say there's a burgeoning movement of theonomists, Christian theonomists. It's still more in isolated pockets. You get it out of kind of Doug Wilson's crowd in Idaho. It's funny. Recently, I think the folk in California, John MacArthur, has been critiquing Christian freedom of late. Not entirely clear what he means by that, but you see large concerns about the way culture is going. So I think a lot of people on the right, the conservative political right, are feeling embattled, feeling like we've lost the cultural war. And the response to that, now I'm talking about evangelical churches right now, okay, especially, and maybe, yeah, I think evangelical churches. The response to that is to sort of grab onto sometimes more thoughtful, sometimes less thoughtful, whether versions of theonomy or something else that doesn't quite have a name, but very much is leaning again into the culture war. So it's just a friend recently sent me a tweet pointing to a sermon by David Bartran, who is kind of one of these God and country types. And
David Barton.
he's David Barton, thank you. He, his I watched, kind of skimmed through this sermon, this hour-long sermon, running into the roar. He said, we got to fight now to kind of reclaim our stakes. Another friend of mine is writing a book called Be Strong and Courageous. Interesting title. Takes that language from Joshua about going into the land of Israel, be strong and courageous, and not applying it to the church, which is what I would do, right? Israel's pointing towards the church. Israel's not pointing towards America, but he's taking that language, be strong and courageous, and pointing to America and how we as saints need to encounter. Okay, well, right there is not like a full-on thought-through integralism, but it's going to commit those same kinds of, or it risks committing those same kinds of mistakes, in which America is taking on the role of Israel as opposed to the church taking on the role of Israel. And that is its own kind of, again, not articulate, but nonetheless functional integralism. So yeah, I think it's happening on the Protestant evangelical sides too, in one form or another.
Mark Levesque, do you see growing illiberalism among American Protestants, conservative Protestants, and evangelicals? And if so, from your perspective, what is the Christian realist response?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's certainly at least the possibility of that, right? The growing tendency toward that. I think Jonathan's laid it out well. I suspect a lot of it comes from this fear that, at its best, that maybe the classical liberal never thought that this was a Christian nation, but it was certainly a nation with a whole lot of Christians, and they had a place in the public square. I think there's increasing, and I don't think entirely wrong-minded, although it goes to crazy extremes, there's an increasing fear that Christians are being increasingly pushed out of the public sphere, the public square, and then there's going to be pushback. Can Christians exist in a liberal society where maybe many feel that one side isn't playing by classical liberal rules? And if Christians continue to play by those classical Christian rules of, an embrace of pluralism, and I'm not saying we've done this well all the time, but if we play by those rules of embracing pluralism and, a warmth toward various perspectives, and the other side isn't, then is it a little bit like entering what we think is a flag football game, but really it's a cage match? So I think that's a fear. I think in some ways, the more extreme on the other side have given evangelical Christians reason to believe that those fears are legitimate. You see the same conversation happening. There was a fascinating conversation at the Naval Academy, I think last week, between two Johns, John Eikenberry and John Mearsheimer, where John Eikenberry was articulating an argument for a continuation of the liberal international order, and Mearsheimer, unsurprisingly, saying, well, no. But Mearsheimer had some very interesting things to say about liberal international order that I think resonate with even a look at classical liberalism more domestically, where he said in order for a classical liberal or a liberal international order to work, and he thinks we haven't had a liberal international order for most of human history. We might have had one in 1990, and then it ended at about 2016. He thinks that was it. And he says part of the reason for that is in order to have a liberal order, you have to have a hegemon. You have to have somebody that exercises some degree of unipolarity, and then they can step back from that power and be warm and generous to minority groups. And if you don't have that hegemon, then you're just going to have all these various factions, and they're going to vie for power. I don't know how true that is, but there's a part of that I kind of think, ooh, that sort of resonates. And do we have anything like a hegemonic worldview in the United States now. Arguably it was Hebraic. Even if people weren't Jewish or Christian, they breathed sort of a Judeo-Christian air. Do we still? And if we don't, then is there anybody, any one group, any one perspective that can step back from its power and say, now let's get along, and here are the terms that we can all do this. We can create this neutral public space. But if we don't have that, is it, in Mearsheimer's terms, just a bunch of factions vying for control?
Dan Strand, what are your thoughts? Are evangelicals prematurely despairing of American liberal democracy?
I don't know. I think I resonate with both sides of this debate, and I find myself agreeing and disagreeing with both sides. I read the integralists. I have spent a lot of time with Catholics, Catholic traditionalists, who, even if they're not full-on integralists, if you read the Catholic social encyclical tradition, it's not democracy friendly. They had to rework it, right? John Courtney Murray and American Catholics had to kind of figure out a way. But if you read Pope Leo XIII, Americanism is used in a disparaging way. So, and I think I found myself nodding a lot. I read a lot of Alistair McIntyre, and I read a lot of communitarian type philosophy. And I think even someone like Charles Taylor, who would probably fancy himself some sort of liberal in a way, still finds there's very deep inconsistencies and there's deep pathologies that run through at least the ideology portion of it. And so I appreciate the criticisms. I tend to go along with Niebuhr in thinking that democracy, given the state of human nature and so forth, is probably the best on offer in terms of governing projects. And I tend to, catch me on a different day, and I'll take one side or the other. I do think, if we're talking about American evangelicals, though, is there a lot of serious thinking within the Christian political theological tradition going on right now? No. There's some people I think Jonathan's wrestling. You see some other people doing some wrestling. That is, in my mind, it's the exception. There's no Oliver O'Donovans in the United States right now, John Milbanks, or any of the other continental. The funny thing is, you have some of the most serious, kind of political theology thinking being done in countries that have secularized or quite secular. The United States, which still has, I think, a pretty lively and robust religious community, at least in terms of politics, is the most that, at least where I see the energy right now, maybe this is just Twitter world, is on issues of race. My problem with this is you have a lot of sort of younger evangelicals, and people say, wow, they're being sensitive to these issues that we've missed the boat on. Hey, I think there's some merit to that, but it tends to be so issue oriented. And maybe this is just the sort of activist issue orientation of American evangelicalism, but it's not being framed in larger sort of political theological tradition. It's not being connected to the hundreds. The Catholics do it because they have a tradition. And here's the strength and weakness of American Protestantism, which is it's an unruly affair, and is pretty averse to tradition, to thinking through a tradition. We don't have an authoritative body of social teachings. That's not a panacea, because you ask any Catholic and they'll tell you most of the people in the pews don't even care about it. But nonetheless, at least they have a sort of ongoing conversation where some of the features are fixed. And if I'm thinking to myself, what would I want amongst American Protestants and evangelicals, it would be returned. Hugo Grotius, for Pete's sake, is one of the most influential thinkers in all of Western history, and I don't know if any and specifically religious and influential. Founder of the international law tradition, and are American Protestants actually reading this guy? You can go on down the list of influential figures. Jonathan's read O'Donovan, I'm sure Mark, other evangelicals have, but we are a select small minority. And so I don't know. I guess in the end, I'm quite skeptical, unless, I mean, discovering the American tradition is one thing, but being able to link that up with sort of broader Christian tradition, I think, is the other. And I don't see a lot of stuff happening on that score. Sorry for
Mark,
the
can I offer?
take. Yeah.
Mark, can I offer an analogy?
Yes.
Just kind of building off what both of these brothers have said. Uh, I spend all day talking to pastors and missionaries in my kind of day job, as it were. And you guys might be familiar with the name of Leslie Newbegin, right? He's a missions writer.
Right.
And his story is that he goes off to India for a number of years, 20, 30 years, I don't know, as a missionary. And then he comes back to England in the 1960s and he looks around and he's like, my goodness, the world has changed. Like, Christendom is over. We need to reconceive what the church's posture is toward the West, towards Britain, towards the West. And it's at that point more and more Christians broadly and eventually evangelical specifically started using this idea of being missional, right? We're missionaries right here because the West is not Christianized the way it once was. We need to change our mindset. I think what's going on in political theology in some ways is very similar, right? We're looking around and we're like, wait a second, okay, this is not Jerusalem. This is more like Babylon. Okay, so what's our posture now? And did our liberalism get us here? Was that part of what went wrong? Or there's some good stuff in liberalism I want to hold on to, but other stuff and so to use Mark Levesque's point, it's like the hegemon or the hegemonic force has changed. It used to be kind of a broadly Protestant Anglo-Protestant worldview that was predominant. Well, I'm looking around. I'm back from India. Sure doesn't feel that way now. Seems like there's another hegemon, or at least a battle for hegemony in a pretty significant way. And so that raises all of these kinds of questions. And so a lot of us feel precisely what I think Daniel was just saying, which is, I like that, but I also like that, and I'm not sure how to put it all together. And I think there are resources for us around the globe from brothers and sisters in Christ. What are our brothers and sisters in Christ in China saying? They can't work in government.
Right.
They can't get a job at the university. What's their posture towards this? What about Christians in Iran? So I think there are other resources out there that hopefully we can grab onto.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you think contemporary evangelicalism is basically reaching the end of its shelf life as a major cultural force and transitioning to something else, or is it premature to say that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm honestly not sure. I mean, the events of recent months have sort of raised these, recent years and months especially have raised this question in my mind. Look, I'm a theologian, and so I want to define evangelical theologically. I want to ground it in the idea of the evangel, the good news of Jesus Christ. He came to live the life that we're to live, died the death that we should die, paying the penalty for sin for all who repent and believe, follow after him. That's the evangel. If you believe that, hey man, you're with me. You're an evangelical, right? And then we could describe it a little bit more sociologically, as some have done. But we also understand that evangelical is in some sense, a political cultural movement. It's a sociological phenomenon. And we see our friends at, New York Times and Washington Post viewing evangelical kind of through those lenses, even though some of us who are Christians want to continue to insist on a theological definition. Thomas Kidd has done great work here trying to extricate these two things. Tim Keller's written a little bit about this in shorter form. So has the movement reached the end of its shelf life? Well, in some ways, Mark, I don't care about the movement. What I care about is the gospel. What I care about is churches preaching that gospel and learning to love one another and be embassies of righteousness and justice for the kingdom of heaven, so the nations would see that we're salt and light. So long as we're doing that, then I'm good, right? Whether or not we as a political movement come or go, one, I'm not sure there is a political, but I see lots of tribes of evangelicals. I see many streams of evangelicals. Insofar there is a monolith that we call evangelical, that's not my main concern. My main concern is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Daniel, you've written for Providence about Christian nationalism as America becomes demographically less Christian. How does one sustain Christian nationalism should it be sustained? You offered a more thoughtful alternative to the usual caricatures of Christian nationalism, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like such a terminological thing that people are so averse to the word nationalism. And I think, at least among academics, that's because the word nationalism is largely a pejorative in academic circles. So you use the word nationalism, and we're talking about Europe 1930, mainly Nazi, it's evocations of Nazism. So it's also refers back to, white nationalism or Jim Crow. That's the way it gets used sometimes in evangelical. At least some folks have highlighted that. So the term itself, I don't know if it can be rescued. It seems largely like it's just a negative term. Call it patriotism, whatever. I do think that at least the spirit behind the idea of Christians having a theological understanding of the role of the state and um, and the theological purposes of politics and law and society is very important. Um, but it just seems, yeah. So my criticism is that I think the critics of Christian nationalism are criticizing a slice. I don't know how big the slice is. I'm fairly skeptical of the sociological studies I've read that they're. I mean, it puts it upwards of sort of 70 to 80% of American evangelicals are Christian nationalists. I don't buy it. I do not buy that. I do think there's a slice of actual church-going evangelicals who have some sort of set of orthodox beliefs. I think there's a lot of heterodox cultural Christianity going on here. In the end, the critics give you a strong and I think serious criticism, but I do not hear any sort of positive. This is where I get back to my sort of hobby horse. What's the alternative? It just they don't. There's not a sort of theological alternative that they're offering. I think it tends to be a little bit more progressive in orientation, social justicey, which is okay. I mean, if you say pick your issue and you can talk about it and relate it, but how does this relate to a broader sort of Christian political theology? I don't hear it. Catholics offer something coherent, and they can give you a pretty straightforward answer. Different Protestants who are more or less thoughtful could give you an answer, but from actual church bodies, from actual church leaders, I think the project, or at least the impetus by my article, is saying that, if we can call it nation, call whatever you want, the idea of citizenship within the Republican tradition of which the United States is drawing apart. This is a transatlantic political tradition of Dutch, British, this whole movement of sort of neo-republicanism that happens it has deep theological roots to it. The idea of citizenship has deep theological roots in it. The idea, the law, you name it, most of these ideas have deep roots. This is why when you read someone like Oliver O'Donovan, you see, I mean, O'Donovan says the liberal tradition just is an outgrowth of Christianity. So it's one political tradition. It's not the only one, but he says it is a Christian tradition, and those in the West can defend it respectably. And I think that's true, but not until we capture something of its sort of deeper essence and find a way to marry it with a deeper set of theological convictions, concepts. And I don't see that. I don't see it right now. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I would love it if Protestants were able to come together on some level across denominations and recapture some of that, and also listen to I think Jonathan's point about the universal church having a lot to teach us. Absolutely. Every time that I've been overseas, I've been humbled and convicted by talking with Christians in other contexts and seeing how they manage, most oftentimes in positions where they're minorities, managed to do a lot of constructive good, and so I'm all for that as well.
Mark Levesque, if all of American evangelicalism were to join a Zoom call with you to get guidance on political theology, what would be your talking points in terms of how to restabilize ourselves for the future?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, riffing on both what I think Jonathan and Daniel have said, I would certainly try to make a place to begin with for a kind of nationalism, heavily qualified, and not even deigning to ascribe or subscribe to any of the particular views that are out there. But I think Daniel's right. I think there's a conversation that has to be had there. If you call it nationalism, if you call it patriotism, that used to be my distinction. I'd say patriotism was a healthy thing, nationalism negative. Entomologically, you can't really justify that. They both more or less mean, a place of native birth. You can throw jingoism out as the bad thing, but depending on which dictionary you look in, jingoism is either an extreme form of patriotism or an extreme form of nationalism. So that doesn't get us far. But I think what people are recognizing, who are taking a nationalistic stand, is one. I think it's some of it is sort of self-defense. It's like, they're defending their mother. They're tired of one side saying that, in this case, America has been a force for evil in the world, undiluted and and not a force for good. So they push against that. Some of that's natural. We should have affection for our homeland. And I say that as an American. Probably not everybody ought to have affection for their homeland. If I was raised in apartheid South Africa, that would be a more difficult question. There would be aspects that I'd want to say, I can embrace this. There would be aspects that I would have to completely disassociate from. So I think some of it's pushback. I think we need to be able to say we can have, it's okay to have special obligations. It's okay to have special affection. Jesus was born into a particular tribe. He was born as a particular kind of person, presumably had a particular kind of set of affections for his homeland, and yet he came to save the world, right? So it doesn't have to be a binary between some sort of universalism and some sort of parochial particularism. Those are false binaries. So it would make a place for a healthy kind of nationalism, and to say there is a healthy kind of self-interest. We can self-love. That's okay. So make a place for that. I would begin to ask how our moral theology ought to shape or how our theology shapes our moral theology and shapes our ethics. I think we get a lot of terminology wrong. One of my hobby horses is the question of Christian love, and how does Christian love manifest in the world? I think Christians are increasingly uncomfortable with the difficult distinctions that have to be made when you try to live out your faith in the world. It's very complicated. What does to love someone mean? So often I think we think it means we never make somebody uncomfortable. And so we end up avoiding hard truths. And that gets us into all sorts of complicated problems. Or we take the other side and we think the hard truth just has to be, thrown at somebody undiluted and without, winsome charity. And that's crazy too. So I push it back to the basics. What is the gospel? How does that manifest in public life? I would urge everybody to remember, the old Johnny Cash song, we can't be so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good, right? The gospel ain't gospel unless it is spread, but how can you spread it where you've got your head, right? We've got to be both. Daniel knows all about the Augustinian distinction between, two cities. There are two kingdoms, and one is above the other. But meanwhile, we live in Babylon, and we're citizens here, and we should care about it, and we should love our neighbor. And loving our neighbor means that we have to have some concern for our neighborhood as well. Mm-hmm. And that has all sorts of uncomfortable requirements, government, and potentially the use of force, and all sorts of things like that. So that's a very fragmented answer to your very precise question, but that's some of what I would say to my horde of Zoom participants.
Jonathan, much of what is described as Christian nationalism seems to be kind of a hodgepodge of nativist folk religion, people who are in fact spiritual and often in churches and certainly reading their Bibles, but there's no catechesis there, and they're reading their Bible and they're reading extremist websites and just throwing it all together in odd brew. But what are your thoughts?
I think people tend to mean one of two things by Christian nationalism. Best I can tell, reading the Twitter and the articles that go along with it, just in the last few weeks. the kind of non-Christian perspective that you're going to get again from, say, mainstream media is that Christian nationalism is any Christians trying to bring Christian influence into the public square. So italics Christian, non-italics nationalism, right? And oh, that's bad. Don't bring your Christianity in the public square. Right? That, I think that's how non-Christians and a few Christians tend to view it. A different view of it is italics now on nationalism, Christian nationalism, meaning emphasis on the nation, meaning God has a plan for the nation. Redemptive history and national history, come together. This is a nouveau secular ordum, or no secular. You can see that on your dollar bill. That America is the new Israel, and kind of manifest destiny ideas, where God is working out his plans for history through America in some sense. That'd be an extreme version of it, but it's one version of that or another. In other words, that's a wrong view of Christianity, right? That's like, hey, Christians, no. God's plan is through the church, not through the nation. He has a place for nations, yes. He has things to do with nations, yes. But his plan of redemption is going to occur through the church, going into all nations. And that's more of a Christian error than a non-Christian error that would lead to something like Christian nationalism, a wrong emphasis, a wrong view of the relationship between the church and the nation. Now, insofar as we're not following biblical prescriptions on these kinds of things, yeah, I think all kinds of other clutter gets thrown into it. And certainly in the media, we see people who are representing any number of things, speaking for Christianity, partnering with Christianity. Honestly, I don't know how big of a problem is that, but I do think some form of syncretism is inevitable in any Christian tradition that begins to look to the world for its marching orders and begins to bring, adopts a political agenda of bring heaven to earth now. You are necessarily going to start looking around and seeing what other partners in the landscape you can find to bring heaven to earth now, which is what Christian nationalism is kind of a version of, at least in the second version. And so, yeah, that's where you get all sorts of syncretistic temptations and possibilities. Again, I don't know how big of a problem this is. We've all seen the photos of horn guy in the Capitol, but is this really a rampant problem? I honestly don't know. Nonetheless, I do think Christian nationalism is something that we need to understand better, and I think there are different versions of it. Depending on who you're talking to, there's a different bad guy. Is the bad guy Christians bringing their stuff in the public square, or is the bad guy Christians not really understanding their Bibles and misunderstanding the relationship between the church and the nation?
Daniel, we've discussed the problems in American evangelical political theology, but I think we're agreed there are some bright lights and some rising impressive thinkers who bear watching. Besides the bright lights who are part of this conversation today, who else is out there whom we should be looking to?
In terms of contemporary conversation, I don't know. At least in America, is there some sort of guiding sort of political theology voice at the moment?
Any particular individuals, thinkers, writers?
Do you like this book, Daniel? Yes or no?
Yeah, Van Drunen. Yeah. So I mean, I think David Van Drunen is a positive sign.
You like this book?
There you go. Yeah, Yuval Levin. I mean, some of the Yuval is conservative writer. Right? Yeah, interesting and important. If I'm thinking about political theology per se, I mean, Van Drunen is probably maybe the one name that I would encourage people. I don't necessarily go along with the whole natural law project that he's undertaking, but I think it's encouraging. There we go. Yeah, Josh Mitchell. Everybody's got their libraries up and going. I mean, my hobby horse, as always, is I actually think we need to stop looking around at our contemporary scene and actually start looking backwards. I think Americans are too caught up in the moment, always looking for the next great thing around the horizon, the next big star, are. I think cult of personality is an issue in American evangelicalism, get attached to personalities. And I just want, not only do I want biblical literacy, I want evangelicals and Protestants to get over their aversion to reading Catholic theology. I still think Catholics are wrong in many respects. The Reformation was right, but nevertheless, that was the church for 1500 years. And there's a lot there. There's just, I mean, the golden age of Christian political theology, you could argue, is probably the 12th century to the 16th century. Honestly, you just have an efflorescence of writing. And I know, Mark, this is right up your alley as well. But I think there's a lot of things that we could do. So I'm not saying this is the magical panacea, but I at least want churches, I want theologians, and I want leaders to be more connected to our long tradition, and to learn from it, and then take it and apply it, and traditions transform. And so I'm not an antiquarian that thinks we're going to reinstate sort of the integralist vision of the world, and I'm sure I really want that, but I still think there's a lot there to learn. So if I'm gonna talk to a young evangelical, I'm gonna say, yes, read Niebuhr, yes, read Van Drunen, but actually go back and read. You need to read Calvin and Luther. You need to read Grotius. You need to go back and read, Catholic, the Salamanca school of theology. You need to read Aquinas. You need to read some canon law. I mean, it's just that is our tradition. That is, Protestants need to say that. That's where I feel like they don't say that. They think that Christianity started, in the 16th century, and I think that's not okay. They need to go back and read Augustine, near and dear to my heart. You need to read patristics. You need to read, and so that won't magically solve the problem, but I think it will ground us more. I think it will keep us from kind of going into these extremes, being sort of caught by the latest ideas. And I think when you see young Christians kind of chasing after the latest buzzwords, going woke, going whatever, becoming like Trumpies, or I think a lot of that is being sort of just caught on the waves of culture and not being anchored to something longer. And so that's what I would counsel my young evangelical friends.
What about your fellow PCA or Tim Keller?
Yeah, you can't speak a bad word about Tim. Everybody, Tim does no wrong in most people's eyes. I mean, Tim, he's an intelligent guy. He's, probably one of the most kind of smart and polymath type people. He just reads so broadly and is just an impressive overall person and pastor. When he comes to social justice stuff, I'm actually kind of a little disappointed. His writing on social justice, he cites very contemporary philosophers, and maybe this just gets back to, when he talks about political issues, he'll talk about Charles Taylor, who's one of his favorites. So I get why he does that. But Alistair McIntyre, Robert Nozick, I mean, these are political philosophers from the 70s and 80s. We can dig deeper than that. I think Christians can dig deeper. Not to say we can't learn. I mean, I read Taylor. I think Taylor's phenomenal, but we have to have a little more confidence in our own tradition to not sort of always be looking. I'm not saying that's what Keller's doing, but what he does so well in other areas, I feel like maybe he's a little bit more kind of symptomatic of the evangelical mind when it comes to political issues, which tend to be pretty contemporary. We tend to think that what the most interesting things to be said are being said right now, or maybe 10 years ago. And I think that just discounts what the church has learned, debated, discussed, and put pen to paper for thousands and thousands of years ago.
Mark Levesque, whom should we be looking to, dead or alive, right now for sound guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think both the flurry of books that went up, I don't know if all the viewers could see that. I think the comments that Dan has about going back to the basics, going all the way back, I think all of that is sound. What comes to mind listening to Dan is, by going deep. I mean, Elshtain, who is one of those names that should be read, but Elshtain would have said, Jean Bethke Elshtain, for those who don't know the shorthand, Gene would have said that, we've become deracinated, right? We've uprooted ourselves from our traditions. There is no tradition to speak of. A tradition requires the experienced hands to be handing on to those inexperienced hands, the customs and the habits that are embodied in that tradition. Going all the way back, hopefully would ground us in certain indispensable things. When I was a young, struggling, agnostic, kind of not sure what I was, what I was getting from my evangelical friends was information about how to get into heaven. And very few people, some key ones did, and I'm eternally, literally grateful to them for it, but very few people ever moved beyond this is how you get into heaven, to trying to explain to me why on God's green earth do I want to get into heaven in the first place. About building in us the capacity not just to know, what ought I do to be good, but like, why do I want to be good? Giving us a love for the good. Christianity has become very often a set of rules. Ethics and moral theology has become a series of proof texting instead of beatitude. Like, how do I shape myself? How can I be shaped into becoming a son of God, somebody who bears the characteristics of the divine? And when that kind of character and moral formation happens, then I think a lot of other things begin more easily to fall into place. It just becomes easier to be a other-centered person who self-donates when you recognize what goodness is and why goodness is worth having. So I would go back, I would steep myself in the tradition, root myself in that, and then moving forward, the individual minds that help people understand what that tradition looks like. I think Gene is great. I think Nigel Bigger in England is a key thinker who understands how the tradition pushes things forward. Nigel's all about, he'll look at the just war tradition and ask, how does the just war tradition promote human flourishing, right? It's about, purposed ends. How does this help us be that which we were created to be? That's what I want to say. I'm not terribly interested, even if I'm teaching my midshipmen. I don't want to just teach them what's the right thing to do in a given situation. I want them to be morally formed so that they're the kinds of people who can go into various situations and figure out what is the right thing to do through moral reasoning and moral deliberation and all the heavy lifting that goes into, moving as a responsible person in this world. There's the bad news there is that that's not an easy lift. And that's a lot of work, and that's a lot of dedication, and people need to spend the time to do those things. You're not going to get it from just walking down the street. You're going to have to do a lot of reading, do a lot of talking, etc.
Jonathan, you were holding up a few books, including one from our Providence contributor, Josh Mitchell. If you're giving counsel to someone who wants to do political theology well, what should they be reading these days?
Can I give the Sunday school answer?
Yes.
Read the Bible. I agree with everything these brothers said, but let me make sure we say what we shouldn't take for granted and read the Bible. I think we are undernourished. I think Christians are undernourished in their understanding of the scriptures and how to read the Bible politically. I think you want to understand I think you need to do your your biblical theology. That is to say, you need to understand the relationship between the different covenants. What's the creation covenant? What's the Noahic covenant? What were the Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, new covenants? What's the relationship between these things? Who is God authorizing to do what? When does he authorize the state? What does he authorize the state to do? What does he authorize the church to do? That's different than separate the authorization that's given to the state. Okay, what about families? What authority does a family have? And my answer to these questions are all going to depend on how I put the whole Bible together, right? How I understand Israel, again, in relation to the church, how I understand the Noahic covenant. Whoever says the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for man was made in God's own image. That's given to all humanity. What authority is going on there? I need to ask and answer these kinds of questions, I think, in order to have a vigorous understanding of what is the state, what is its authority, what is the church, what is its authority, what is the family, what is its authority. And I think a lot of people today use the language of separation of church and state, and we're all trying to negotiate that, but we really have no idea what the church is or what the authority this church should have. And if you don't know what the authority of the church should have, or what a church is, how are you going to define the relationship between church and state? Church becomes just kind of this vague term for my Christianity. Well, my Christianity is not the same thing as my church and its authority. And so to figure out the relationship between church and state, I got to be able to answer these kind of more fundamental questions about the distinction between these different institutions, and behind that, what's the relationships of the covenants in the Bible, which means I got to know how to read my Bible well, right? So that when I get to the kind of everybody's favorite proof texts like render to Caesar what is Caesar, render God what is God's, or Romans 13, he is God's servant, appointed for your good, to punish evil or the good, First Peter, same sort of thing. So when I get to those proof texts, I'm not just kind of importing my worldview into that, my classical liberal or my post-liberal worldview into those texts. Rather, I'm reading those texts within the narrative of all of Scripture and the covenantal storyline of all of Scripture, so that I'm doing them faithfully. Okay, once I have that biblical foundation, that biblical starting point, then I want to step into conversation with the tradition, with contemporary authors, and so forth. And I can have a conversation with them from my biblical perspective, right? So I'd like to see a little bit more, again, affirming everything those brothers just said. I also want to see, in addition to that, a greater biblical literacy for the young believer, the Sunday school attender, the old man and woman sitting in the pews, the pastor, certainly for the pastor. Pastors, what authority does the church have, pastor? What authorities, can you answer that, pastor? If you can't answer that, how's your congregation going to do that? And then how are they going to engage in the public square meaningfully, intelligently, if their own pastor can't define what the state is, what the church is? So this is kind of my exhortation to church leaders out there. And do you lead a Bible study? I bet you a number of people watching this have led a Bible study once about or taught a Sunday school class. What is justice? What is justice according to Scripture? Forget social justice for a second. Just put that to the side. What does the Bible say justice is? Then you can step in and have a conversation with social justice and kind of like, okay, well, I understand from Scripture it's this or it's not that. And we go from there. So more biblical literacy. That's what I'd really want to see among the younger generation rising up.
Jonathan Lehman, Mark Lavecchi, Daniel Strand, thank you so much for a very insightful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks, Mark.